The night wind pressed against the ruined administrative wing of the former Gestapo headquarters in Königsberg, carrying with it the heavy breath of a city collapsing under the final tremors of the war. Snow drifted through the fractured windows in languid spirals, settling on the stone floors where maps, reports, and abandoned uniforms lay scattered like remnants of a vanished world. The building had been evacuated in haste months earlier, its masters fleeing eastward as artillery thundered ever closer. Now it stood empty, steeped in silence, a mausoleum of secrets the Reich never intended anyone to uncover. It was here, weeks after the Red Army seized the city, that a Soviet archivist named Mikhail Orelkin stepped through the warped doorway of the intelligence storage room and felt the strange pull of something that did not belong. Orelkin was not a man prone to superstition. He had sifted through burned ledgers, blood-stained dossiers, and the remains of countless compromised safe houses. He had learned to walk without reacting to the smell of mildew and old fear. Yet the moment he crossed into the dim corridor, he sensed a presence. Not a ghost, but the echo of a life compressed into the walls themselves. The file room was different from the others he had catalogued. Instead of chaos, everything had been left in unnervingly precise disarray, as though someone had tried to destroy evidence but ran out of time. Piles of paper had been swept into corners rather than burned. Cabinets stood ajar but not emptied. A single hanging light bulb swayed gently in the draft, casting an unstable glow across the room. He took careful steps along the uneven floor, brushing aside debris. As his hand grazed the wall, he felt the hollow thud beneath the plaster, subtle but unmistakable. He stopped, pressed again, and listened. Beneath the surface, something metallic shifted. Using a rusted tool, he chipped away at the plaster until it cracked open like aged bone. Dust unfurled outward in a thin cloud. His flashlight beam cut into the cavity, illuminating an object small enough to conceal in a closed fist. It was an iron metal, dull with age, its surface etched with a faint insignia, almost lost beneath grime. Orelkin retrieved it slowly, as though afraid it might crumble in his hand. Soviet metals were familiar to him. Each carried the weight of a story, a deed, a life. But this one was different. The serial number was not listed in any registry he had ever seen. The emblem was a variant, used only in the most restricted branch of Soviet deep-cover operations, rarely spoken of, and even more rarely acknowledged. Operatives entrusted with such commendations were ghosts by design. Their names existed only in top-secret archives. Their faces were never photographed. Their identities were upheld through layers of denial so thick that even the NKVD kept their profiles sealed behind multiple locks. Orelkin turned the metal over again, feeling an unnatural chill creep into his fingers. There should not have been a Soviet operative embedded within the Gestapo at Königsberg. No intelligence officer had ever reported a successful penetration of that inner circle at such a high level. There had been attempts, rumors, and scattered notes about informants, but nothing more. Certainly nothing like this. He reached deeper into the cavity. His fingers brushed against brittle paper. The fragment he pulled out was a torn page from a Gestapo interrogation ledger, edges frayed and stained, as if gripped in a moment of desperation. Most of the ink had bled into the paper over time, becoming little more than dark smudges. But in the margin, written in hurried Cyrillic, were words that made Orelkin's breath catch. "I am running out of time. If anyone finds this, know that I did not break." Beneath the sentence, smeared and nearly unreadable, was a single initial, V. The discovery felt less like archaeology and more like listening to a voice pulled out of a grave. Orelkin, knelt among the debris, trying to steady the trembling in his hands. Who was this V? How had he embedded himself within the very machine designed to crush resistance before it could take shape? Why had he left behind a medal that should have remained on his person until death? Had he hidden it deliberately, or had it been ripped from him by someone who knew his secret? The city outside groaned under the weight of winter. Somewhere in the streets below, soldiers were shouting, hauling supplies, setting up temporary checkpoints in buildings half devoured by fire. Yet in the cold quiet of the room, the world shrank to a single, impossible truth. A Soviet agent had stood in this same spot, concealed behind a facade of loyalty to the Reich, and vanished in 1944 without leaving even a whisper in the official record. The file room's shadows stretched across the floor like long fingers as Orelkin stood and swept his flashlight across the shelves. Several volumes had been removed intentionally. Dust patterns showed the absence of thick binders once stored neatly in sequence. Someone had erased traces of their life here with methodical precision, and yet the cavity in the wall remained untouched until Orelkin arrived, suggesting that whoever sealed it had done so in haste, perhaps in the final hours before discovery. He lifted the medal again, examining the scratches along its edge. These were not marks of age. They were gouges, the kind left when metal scraped against a stone during a struggle. His pulse quickened. If V had fought, then someone had come close to uncovering the truth. And perhaps V knew it. V's identity became a whisper in the Red Army's improvised archives, a puzzle missing most of its pieces. The Soviets had no surviving transcripts of communication from an operative stationed in Königsberg in 1944, but the Germans did. As Orelkin dug deeper into the stacks of papers scattered across the room, he found reports referencing an internal leak, coded messages transmitted through channels so deeply buried within the Gestapo's infrastructure that suspicion had turned inwards, sparking a quiet but vicious purge. Officers were interrogated, and informants rotated and replaced, files reclassified. And somewhere among those who walked the corridors daily, there had been a man who watched, listened, collected, and transmitted. He had been described only once in the German reports. An intelligence officer with a precise gait, an unremarkable face, and a manner so restrained, it seemed almost intentionally designed to blend into the walls. He spoke little. He observed everything. Officers recalled his posture, his immaculate uniform, the disciplined curve of his handwriting in routine reports. But none of them could remember his eyes, or the cadence of his voice, or the details of his origin beyond a vague reference to the Eastern Territories. He existed on the periphery of their memories, as though he had deliberately chosen to inhabit the margins of their perception. The deeper Orelkin searched, the more disquieting the truth became. The coded messages intercepted by Soviet intelligence during early 1944, brief, surgical, and unmistakably written by someone with access to the Gestapo's inner security structures, shared one identifying marker, a signature embedded through subtle shifts in phrasing, a pattern visible only under close scrutiny, a pattern that matched the style of the hastily scrawled note found inside the wall. V, if you're watching this and the shadows of this story begin to wrap themselves around you, tell me something before we descend further into the labyrinth. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Your voice helps anchor us as we walk deeper into the dark. The reconstructed fragments revealed enough to form the silhouette of a man whose life had been consumed by dual loyalties, by the crushing secrecy of espionage, and by the merciless gaze of two empires. The Gestapo suspected him. The Soviets forgot him. And somewhere between these opposing forces, he tried to survive long enough to pass on the last pieces of intelligence that might alter the course of a collapsing war. The more Orelkin pieced together, the clearer one truth became. V had not been discovered immediately. He had operated successfully for months, even as paranoia intensified. But in late 1944, the reports abruptly changed tone. A section chief noted inconsistencies in one of V's files. Another mentioned that he had begun working later hours. One officer recalled seeing him enter the archive alone after midnight. And then, as winter deepened, he vanished. No dismissal record, no transfer, no execution report, no escape log, just silence. And hidden behind the wall, a medal no agent would abandon voluntarily, the last fragment of V's writing. They suspect, but do not know. I continue. I must. Was the closest thing to a final confession he ever offered. The ink strokes were shaky, smeared as if written while listening for approaching footsteps. There were faint impressions on the paper suggesting pressure marks, as though another sheet once rested on top. The missing page might still lie somewhere in the rubble of Königsberg, or it may have been destroyed by hands that understood exactly what V had risked. Nobody knew if he was executed by the Gestapo, eliminated quietly by Soviet handlers who feared he had been compromised, or if he slipped into the chaos of fleeing convoys, only to meet an anonymous death on the road. But something in the cavity of that wall suggested a man who understood he was leaving behind the last trace of himself. A single object capable of rupturing the boundary between truth and myth. As the light flickered overhead, Orelkin closed his fingers around the metal and felt an almost imperceptible warmth, as though the memory of the man who once carried it still imprinted itself upon the metal. The air grew thicker. The room seemed smaller. The silence felt unnaturally aware, as if the walls themselves remembered V's final moments. And perhaps they did. This story is only beginning to open, its shadows stretching wider with every discovery. If narratives like this hold you, if you feel the pull of forgotten corridors and vanished operatives, consider staying with us as we continue to unearth the truth. Subscribe, so you don't miss the next descent into the darkness surrounding V. Because what comes next will take us even deeper into the cold heart of 1944. The corridors of the Königsberg headquarters were built like arteries of power, long, narrow, lined with doors that never opened unless someone higher in command permitted them to. Even when full of movement, they were quiet, as though sound itself feared to linger too long within those walls. In early 1944, they still pulsed with a rhythm of cold precision, boots clicking against marble floors, telephones ringing in brief, clipped bursts, documents moving from one gloved hand to another in a choreography of control. It was inside this world of order and paranoia that the man known only as V lived his dual existence, an infiltrator wearing the uniform of his enemy. He had learned to breathe like them, walk like them, speak in the precise cadences that reflected confidence without familiarity. He had erased every trace of accent that betrayed him, silenced every instinct that could expose him, and replaced his fear with calculation. To survive among wolves, one had to become the silence that moved between their teeth. Every day began the same way. V would arrive before dawn, passing through the main checkpoint with his identification papers, papers signed by the very officers who hunted spies. He would pause at the second security station, where a young clerk, often exhausted and half-frozen, would salute him without enthusiasm. No one questioned his presence. He had built his position meticulously, layer by layer, forging credibility through relentless competence. He filed reports no one wanted to read, but everyone depended on. He found ways to make himself indispensable while remaining invisible. It was the perfect cover for someone who was, in truth, erasing the Reich from the inside. The operation that placed him there had begun years earlier, orchestrated by one of the most elusive divisions within Soviet intelligence. These deep-cover infiltrations were reserved for agents of exceptional control, individuals capable not only of deception, but of transformation. They had to become entirely new people, their pasts rewritten, their identities fabricated through meticulous bureaucratic alchemy. V had been chosen for this because of his linguistic precision, his photographic memory, and his uncanny ability to adapt. He was not the strongest or the most ruthless among his peers, but he possessed something rarer, an almost pathological calm, a stillness that allowed him to mirror the behaviors of others until no difference could be detected. In Königsberg, his cover was simple but effective. A mid-level intelligence analyst attached to the Gestapo's Foreign Operations Unit, tasked with collating intercepted communications from occupied territories. It gave him access to decoded messages, prisoner transfer lists, and internal reports. Exactly the kind of information Moscow needed. For over 2 years, his transmissions reached Soviet handlers through an intricate network of couriers, smugglers, and compromised officers who never knew his real name. Each message was concise, stripped of sentiment. Each report was structured with mechanical precision, yet hidden within its phrasing were subtle indicators of his state of mind, tiny variations in syntax that, to those trained to read them, revealed exhaustion, fear, and sometimes a faint glimmer of pride. But by January 1944, something had shifted. The Gestapo had begun to devour itself. As the front lines drew closer and the war's inevitable collapse grew visible, loyalty became a currency too fragile to trust. Rumors spread of Soviet spies embedded in high-ranking offices, of internal documents reaching Moscow before Berlin even received them. A handful of officers vanished without record, officially transferred, unofficially executed. Files were purged, interrogations doubled, and suspicion began to bleed into every conversation. V knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the irregularities he had so carefully disguised. The first sign came when one of his coded reports failed to reach its destination. His contact in Königsberg, an elderly railway inspector codenamed Ash Tree, had been arrested during a routine sweep. Within days, V's entire courier line went dark. He could not transmit, could not receive instructions. For the first time in his mission, he was completely alone. Isolation was more dangerous than exposure. Without communication, he was a ghost, untethered to either side, trapped in enemy territory with no way to prove allegiance to anyone. He adjusted quickly, constructing contingency plans, erasing evidence of his hidden work. He moved through the corridors as if nothing had changed, but in his mind, he began the process of retreat, an internal withdrawal from the persona he had built. Each night, he would return to his quarters in the administrative wing, close the door, and sit in the dark, listening to the faint hum of machinery from the lower levels. There, in the silence, he would trace invisible lines across the wooden table, mapping the threads of information he had already transmitted, wondering which of them might now be burning someone else alive. The paranoia inside the headquarters became almost tangible. Conversations were shorter. Eyes lingered too long. Every officer seemed to be measuring every other's movements. A rumor circulated that an internal mole had been found in Krakow, a man who had worked undetected for years, sending intelligence directly to Soviet command. He had confessed, under interrogation, they said, naming others scattered across the Reich. But the confession was never published. No one knew his name. The story existed to feed suspicion, to set the hunters loose on their own ranks. Va kept his composure. He continued to file reports, continued to speak the right words at the right times, even as he began preparing for his disappearance. He began to hide fragments of himself throughout the building, not in letters or obvious signs, but in patterns, in small anomalies. Only someone trained to read them would notice. A page, out of order here, a stamp slightly misaligned, dates that, when read sequentially, pointed to a code. It was his final attempt to leave behind proof that he had existed should the worst happen, and the worst was coming. By late February, the Gestapo launched an internal review across multiple offices. Every agent was re-evaluated, every background rechecked. Officers were pulled from duty and interrogated without explanation. V's name appeared on the list of those to be reviewed, not for suspicion of espionage, but due to inconsistencies in his personnel record. He understood immediately what that meant. Someone had noticed a fragment of truth, too small to matter in peacetime, had become lethal in war. He spent the night before his evaluation preparing. He destroyed his remaining cipher sheets, burned his secondary credentials, and sealed his personal logbook, a record of every communication he had ever sent, inside the cavity behind the wall in his quarters. Alongside it, he placed his medal. Not out of sentiment, but as an act of defiance. It was a final message to those who would one day find it. I existed. I was here. I fought you from within. He went to his evaluation the next morning in perfect uniform. His manner was calm, his responses precise. The officers conducting the questioning were low-ranking, young, tense, desperate to prove loyalty. They asked about his birthplace, his education, his prior assignments. He answered each one without hesitation, maintaining the same neutral tone. But near the end, one of them asked an unexpected question. Do you believe the Reich will win this war? The pause that followed was microscopic, imperceptible to most. But for a man living under the constant gaze of suspicion, it felt eternal. He answered as any officer would. Of course, we will endure. We have no alternative. Yet in that moment, he knew the question had been bait. They were watching for micro-expressions, for any flicker of doubt. When the interview ended, he saluted, turned, and walked away with steady steps. He was never seen in the building again. What happened in the hours that followed is pieced together only from secondary accounts. A janitor reported seeing a man matching his description entering the archives after midnight. Another claimed he heard distant footsteps near the service stairwell long after curfew. The next morning, V's quarters were found empty. The bed was made, the window slightly ajar. The only sign of life was a faint trace of cigarette smoke and a single sheet of paper folded neatly on the desk, a routine report unsigned. The Gestapo assumed desertion. The Soviets assumed death. Neither filed confirmation. His absence was absorbed by the chaos of war, lost among thousands of other disappearances. Yet the peculiar thoroughness of his self-erasure suggested intent. He hadn't fled. He had vanished deliberately, dissolving his identity like ink in water. Years later, when Orelkin uncovered the metal behind the wall, the faint impressions of V's life resurfaced, not as a full story, but as echoes. The way he must have moved through those corridors, memorizing the sound of every footstep. The way he must have looked over his shoulder before sealing the wall, knowing that no one would ever remember his name. There are those who believe V escaped, slipping through the collapsing front lines and re-emerging under another identity, perhaps even within Soviet intelligence itself. Others think he was caught and executed quietly, his body discarded in an unmarked grave, his name struck from every ledger. And a few, those who have spent too long reading the silence between the archives, believe something stranger. They say V never left the building at all, that in the confusion of evacuation, his body was entombed within the very walls he had used to hide his life's work, that somewhere, behind the layers of plaster and brick, he still rests, metal gone from his chest, story half told, waiting for the world to remember. If you can feel the chill of those halls through this story, if the idea of a man disappearing inside his own disguise unsettles you, leave a sign, like V once did. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and help us trace the outline of his shadow. And if you wish to walk deeper into this mystery, subscribe to the channel, because the next descent will take us beyond the walls, into the Gestapo's underground chambers, where V's final transmission may still echo, faint but alive, 70 years after his disappearance. The discovery of the metal was only the beginning. In the weeks following that day inside the ruined Gestapo headquarters, Mikhail Orelkin found himself consumed by the silence that lingered within those walls. What had begun as a routine post-liberation cataloging mission slowly twisted into something far stranger. A haunting investigation not sanctioned by any superior, guided instead by a growing obsession with the invisible man who had once walked those same corridors under the enemy's emblem. Every document Orelkin touched seemed to breathe with fragments of V's presence, like fingerprints burned into paper by invisible fire. The further he read, the more he began to feel that the building itself was watching him, as though aware that its secrets were being unsealed after decades of forced sleep. Königsberg was barely alive that spring. The Red Army's shells had reduced most of the city to skeletal ruins. The air reeked of smoke, iron, and rot. Snow had melted into a black slush that carried ash through the streets like drifting memories. Survivors moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed and wordless. Soldiers patrolled intersections not out of necessity, but habit, as though still waiting for a war that had already ended. Orelkin rented a small room above a collapsed bakery near the cathedral. Each night he would sit beneath the flicker of a weak oil lamp, spreading the recovered files across his desk in careful sequences, trying to reconstruct the life of the man behind the letter V. At first it was only data, interrogation reports, duty rosters, fragments of intercepted communiques. But the pattern began to emerge, subtle irregularities that suggested deliberate interference. V had been meticulous but not perfect. Orelkin began mapping the dates of certain Gestapo reports against Soviet field transmissions from the same months. There were coincidences too precise to dismiss, brief coded messages that mirrored the phrasing of German intelligence summaries, delivered days or even hours before those reports reached Berlin. Whoever V had been, his information had reached Moscow faster than official channels could process it. Each new discovery deepened Orelkin's unease. He worked in silence, rarely sleeping, sometimes pausing only to listen to the hum of the wind moving through the cracks in the building's bones. He began to hear things at night. A faint scraping within the walls, the hollow rattle of loose pipes, the irregular tapping that echoed through the ceiling like cautious footsteps. He told himself it was nothing. The ruins were full of sounds. But somewhere in the back of his mind, the thought persisted. Perhaps V had never left. Perhaps the walls themselves had kept a record of him in their own way. The first major breakthrough came when Orelkin found a sealed envelope tucked between two ledgers. It was blank, no markings, sealed with wax so brittle it cracked under his fingers. Inside was a single photograph, faded almost to oblivion. It showed a group of Gestapo officers standing outside the Königsberg headquarters in 1943. Their faces sharp in the winter sun. Most were identifiable from existing personnel records. But at the far edge of the frame, almost lost to the shadow of a doorway, stood a figure half turned away from the camera. His face was blurred by motion, as if caught between breaths. Yet something in his posture, in the measured angle of his shoulders, made Orelkin freeze. The man was wearing a standard officer's uniform, but the insignia on his sleeve was slightly misaligned, an error no German tailor would have allowed. He looked closer. The man's right hand, half concealed by his coat, held what appeared to be a folded document. On the paper's edge, a faint line of Cyrillic script was visible, though tiny, nearly imperceptible, but there nonetheless. It was impossible to know what it said, but Orelkin felt the pulse in his neck quicken. Someone had hidden in plain sight, leaving behind evidence visible only to those who knew how to look. That night, Orelkin could not sleep. He laid the photograph beside the medal on his desk and stared at them until the lamplight began to fade. The room seemed to darken unevenly, as though the corners had thickened. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes. In that half-dreaming state, between exhaustion and obsession, he imagined V standing in the doorway once again, frozen forever in the photograph, half inside, half outside, neither alive nor gone. Days turned into weeks. Orelkin's superiors in Moscow requested his return, but he delayed, claiming unfinished archival work. The truth was simpler. He could not leave. Something inside the Königsberg ruins had anchored itself to him, drawing him deeper into the labyrinth of the past. Every discovery led to another unanswered question. Every silence whispered that he was being guided by more than chance. Then, one afternoon, while combing through an abandoned filing room beneath the main floor, Orelkin found the second fragment of V's handwriting. It was hidden inside a hollow of the desk, sealed beneath a false drawer panel. The note was short, written in pencil, almost erased by time. They close in. I cannot sleep. I must become the wall. The phrasing struck Orelkin like a blow. Become the wall. It wasn't a metaphor, not entirely. The cavity, where the metal had been found, was deep, narrow, precisely measured. It would have taken time to carve it out, more time than a man fearing discovery should have had. Unless, of course, he had been planning it long before. Unless the wall had been built not merely as a hiding place, but as a refuge. A chill passed through Orelkin as he stared at the words. Could it be that V had sealed himself inside? The thought was absurd, grotesque even, but the war had birthed horrors far stranger than that. Men had built tombs for themselves before. Men had vanished willingly when the world became too small to hold their secrets. He returned to the exact room where the medal had been found. The air was thick with dust, cold despite the spring thaw. He traced his hands along the wall's surface, feeling for irregularities. The plaster was uneven in places, as though repaired hastily after damage. Beneath one section, he detected a subtle hollow resonance, different from the rest. His pulse quickened. He fetched his chisel and began to scrape away the top layer. The dust rose like smoke, clinging to his clothes and face. After several minutes, the outline of a sealed compartment appeared. A narrow recess, barely wider than a man's shoulders. The smell that escaped was dry, mineral, old. He shone his light inside, expecting only debris. Instead, he saw a small collection of objects laid neatly along the inner edge. A rusted lighter, a strip of leather, 2 ration tokens, and a notebook, its cover blackened by time. He reached in carefully and drew it out. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably the same as the previous fragments. The first entry was dated February 23rd, 1944. I am still among them. They watch me closely. I feel the ceiling closing lower each day. But I have one more task to complete. Orelkin read every page, his heart pounding faster with each word. The entries grew increasingly fragmented as they continued, oscillating between calm precision and disjointed delirium. The walls are safer than people. The silence is cleaner than breath. I hear them walking above me when I sleep. I wonder if the sound they hear beneath their feet is me. The final page ended abruptly. They are here. I can hear the door. If I write, I exist. If I stop, I... The rest was a violent scrawl, then nothing. Orelkin sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying the faint toll of the cathedral bell. The city seemed to exhale around him. He closed the notebook, his fingers trembling. The evidence suggested what he could barely bring himself to imagine. That V had sealed himself inside the wall deliberately, transforming his own disappearance into a kind of permanent camouflage. In the chaos of retreat, as officers destroyed records and fled, no one would have noticed the missing man or the quiet patch of plaster concealing his tomb. It was genius. It was madness. It was both. For the next several days, Orelkin avoided sleep entirely. He documented everything, photographed the site, and wrote a classified report that he never sent. He feared what Moscow would do with it. To them, V was a ghost, useful only as propaganda, a symbol of loyalty beyond death. But to Orelkin, he was something else, the embodiment of a deeper truth about the war, about the men who fought it from the shadows. Spies were tools, yes, but also human, fragile minds carrying unbearable weight. Some vanished because they had to. Others vanished because it was the only way to remain pure in a world where survival required betrayal. Late one night, as Orelkin sat reviewing his notes, the oil lamp flickered violently. A low rumble rolled through the building, though there was no storm outside. He looked toward the wall where the compartment had been opened. The air seemed to shimmer faintly. For a moment, he could almost see the outline of a man's silhouette in the plaster, the suggestion of shoulders, a bowed head, the faint curve of a hand pressed against stone. Then it was gone. Only dust remained. He did not mention the vision in any of his notes. But from that night on, Orelkin could not remain in the building after sunset. He finished his documentation, sealed the notebook and the medal inside a reinforced crate, and requested immediate transfer. His report was filed quietly, without acknowledgement. The evidence disappeared into Soviet archives under a classification so deep it would never surface again. Decades later, the story of the vanished spy became a whisper among historians, dismissed as myth or coincidence. Yet the medal still exists, its serial number untraceable, its metal faintly scarred by the marks of a man who had chosen to become his own secret. If you can still hear the echo of V's final breath, trapped in the walls of Königsberg, then you understand why these stories matter. Shadows don't vanish, they wait. They linger until someone looks long enough to see them move. Like what you've uncovered so far. Stay close. The next descent goes deeper still, beneath Königsberg, into the Gestapo's subterranean vaults, where the truth behind V's last mission still breathes, sealed under layers of stone and silence. The tunnels beneath Königsberg were never meant to be found. They were carved during the height of the war, winding arteries of stone and steel, meant to connect the Gestapo headquarters to the city's military command posts and the freight yards on the edge of the river. Even now, after decades of neglect, they still carried the smell of rust, oil, and the faint residue of fear. When Mikhail Orelkin first descended into those lower levels, guided only by a dim lantern and his relentless curiosity, he understood immediately that he had crossed into a space the war had not fully surrendered. The air was colder there. The walls sweated condensation that trickled like tears down their surface. Every sound seemed amplified. The drip of water, the distant echo of shifting rubble, the creak of his boots against the uneven floor. The deeper he went, the stronger the sense became that he was walking not through a ruin, but through a memory that refused to die. His superiors had given him permission to survey the sublevels for remaining documents, but his true reason was unspoken. He believed V's final transmission had originated from somewhere below. In the fragments of the notebook recovered from the wall, several entries referenced the tunnels and the lower room. One passage in particular struck Orelkin as a coded confession. They think they buried their secrets beneath the earth. But the earth remembers everything. The silence below has a pulse. If I disappear, look for me where the walls breathe. He had not understood the meaning then. But as he descended further, the words took on a different weight. The tunnels did breathe. Air moved through them in faint drafts, shifting temperature and rhythm, as though the ground itself exhaled. The sensation was uncanny, alive. The first chamber he reached was a supply vault, its walls lined with rusted shelving and decayed crates. Most of the contents were useless. Scraps of paper, broken tools, rotted uniforms. But one object stood out, a small wooden box, sealed with an iron clasp and marked with a faint emblem, an eagle with fractured wings. Inside were several microfilm reels and a sealed envelope marked Nur for direction, for the directorate only. Orelkin's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a typed document, its German text fading but still legible. It referenced an internal directive dated March 2nd, 1944, ordering a special interrogation to be conducted below ground under restricted conditions. The subject was unnamed. The document included a chilling instruction. The individual may possess information originating from the East. Extraction must be complete before termination. No written report to be filed beyond this communication. Beneath the paragraph was a handwritten note, transfer initiated by Hauptsturmführer Kossler at 0247. The prisoner referred to himself only as V. Orelkin froze. His breath fogged in the lantern's light. For the first time he had proof, not rumor, not speculation, that V had been captured, not vanished voluntarily, not spirited away by the chaos of war, but taken into these tunnels for interrogation. The weight of that realization settled over him like a shroud. He continued deeper. The corridors twisted unpredictably, branching into smaller passageways that disappeared into darkness. In one section, the floor had collapsed, exposing a lower level filled with stagnant water. He crossed it cautiously on a narrow plank, his lantern's glow reflecting off the black surface. The deeper chambers bore signs of hasty abandonment. Overturned chairs, shattered light fixtures, a faint trace of burned paper on the air. And then he found the cell. It was small, barely large enough for a man to stand upright, its walls stained with damp and something darker. Chains still hung from the ceiling. The floor was littered with scraps of torn fabric. On one wall, etched faintly into the plaster by a sharp object, were the remains of words written in Cyrillic. Most had eroded into nothing, but 3 remained legible. I did not break. The echo of those words, the same phrase found on the first torn note, rippled through Orelkin's mind. He reached out and touched the marks. The grooves were shallow, hesitant at first, then deeper toward the end, as though carved in desperation. The final stroke cut so deep it had chipped the plaster. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the scene. V brought down here in the dead of night, stripped of rank and name, questioned by men who understood neither his language nor his loyalty. Hours turning into days. The cold, the silence, the walls closing in. And in those final moments, a decision to leave behind one last trace of defiance before the darkness consumed him. But there was something else. On the floor near the wall, half buried under debris, Orelkin's lantern revealed the outline of another small object. He brushed away the dirt, revealing a thin piece of metal, bent, scorched, but unmistakably part of a Soviet radio transmitter. The model was obsolete by the war's end, used primarily by field operatives in 1943 and 1944. He turned it over carefully. The serial number was partially visible, and when he compared it to his notes, he saw it matched the registry of a device last reported lost near the Baltic border that same year. V had managed to bring his transmitter with him into the heart of the Gestapo's labyrinth, and perhaps, in those final hours, he had tried to send one last message. The rest of the tunnel network extended further than the map suggested. In the second chamber beyond the cell, Orelkin found evidence of a small command post, desks, typewriters, filing cabinets, all corroded by decades of damp. One of the desks bore an engraving scratched into its surface, "Veritas non perit," truth does not perish. It was a Latin phrase occasionally used in Gestapo insignia, but Orelkin could not shake the feeling that this one had been left intentionally by someone else. He copied it into his notes and pressed them onward. At the farthest point of the tunnel, he came upon a sealed steel door. The hinges were fused with rust. Above it, in faded paint, was a single word, Sonderakte, special files. He spent nearly an hour forcing it open. The door groaned like an animal in pain, and when it finally gave way, a gust of stale air burst outward. The room beyond was vast, circular, lined with rows of metal filing drawers and broken electrical equipment. The center of the floor was scorched black, as though a fire had been lit there long ago. Among the ash and debris lay another notebook, bound in leather. The first pages were blank. The second contained a brief entry written in shaky handwriting that was not German. It was Russian. They tried to silence me, but the air carries sound even through stone. I spoke. Someone heard. Orelkin stared at the words for a long time. His lantern flickered. He looked around the room, half expecting to hear a whisper, the faint trace of static from a transmitter long dead. The silence pressed against his ears like weight. In that moment, the reality of what had happened began to crystallize. V had been brought down here, tortured, perhaps executed, but in the final moments, he had managed to send a message through the interference. A transmission no one officially recorded, yet one that might still exist, embedded somewhere in the static of wartime radio archives. The thought ignited a fever in Orelkin's mind. If he could find it, if he could recover the sound of V's final voice, he could give form to the ghost that had haunted him for months. When he emerged from the tunnels hours later, daylight burned his eyes. The city above felt unreal, fragile, as though it existed only as a thin veil stretched over the darkness beneath. He returned to his quarters and began the next phase of his investigation, tracing the record of Soviet field transmissions from Königsberg's final months. He worked through nights without sleep, listening to endless reels of static, searching for anomalies, bursts of irregular frequency, coded pauses, fragments of speech buried beneath interference. After weeks of searching, he found it. A single 10-second clip embedded in a Soviet recording, dated March 3rd, 1944. The official documentation listed it as unintelligible noise, but to Orelkin's trained ear, it was something else. He filtered the sound repeatedly, isolating layers of distortion until faint syllables began to emerge. A man's voice, faint, distorted, but undeniably human. The words were fractured by time, but parts were clear enough to understand. I am here. Do not forget the silence. It speaks. Orelkin sat motionless, the sound still echoing through his headphones. His throat tightened. There was no signature, no code phrase, but he knew. It was V, the last trace of a man who had vanished into the walls of his enemy's heart. He copied the audio onto a separate reel, sealing it with the same care he had given the medal and the notebook. Together, they formed the incomplete remains of a life, objects that refused to let history close around them. He labeled the package simply, Recovered Evidence, Königsberg, 1944. Believe. And then, for the first time in months, he slept. But the story did not end there. In the years that followed, rumors circulated among Soviet archivists of a forbidden reel stored deep within the intelligence archives, a recording said to carry the voice of a ghost. Those who heard it claimed that the sound changed depending on who listened, that in some versions the voice spoke new words, as though continuing a message no one had yet finished decoding. Orelkin never commented on those rumors. He retired quietly, his findings buried beneath layers of classification. Yet he kept a copy of the medal's photograph on his desk until the day he died. If you followed this far, through tunnels where the war still breathes, remember this. Every secret has an echo, and every echo is waiting for someone to listen. Stay with us. The fifth descent will take you into the post-war cover-up, the erasure of V's name by those he served, and the silence Moscow imposed on its own ghosts. Subscribe and keep the light close. The next shadow is already moving. The years after the war swallowed Königsberg whole. By the time the Soviets renamed it Kaliningrad, the city had become a skeleton wrapped in new skin, a place where streets bore strange names, and history itself was buried beneath layers of denial. The ruins of the Gestapo headquarters were sealed, and later demolished under the pretense of reconstruction. Officially, it had been nothing more than a bomb-damaged administrative site. Unofficially, its destruction served a quieter purpose. to erase the physical evidence of something that should never have existed. Mikhail Orelkin watched it all from a distance. The discovery of V's medal, the notebook, and the recording had been his life's defining moment. But it was also the beginning of his undoing. Within months of submitting his classified report, the order came down from Moscow. All materials related to Operation Königsberg were to be sealed under indefinite restriction. Access was limited to a handful of high-ranking intelligence officers, none of whom ever spoke of it again. The existence of the Soviet spy inside the Gestapo, V, was officially denied. No file, no name, no recognition, only silence. For Orelkin, this silence was unbearable. He had seen too much to accept the version of truth being built around him. His superiors praised his diligence, transferred him to a new post, and told him to forget. But forgetting was impossible. Every night, as he lay awake in his new apartment in Moscow, he would hear again the faint, broken voice from the recovered reel. "I am here. Do not forget the silence. It speaks." It was less a message than a haunting, a remnant of a consciousness that refused to be buried. Over the following decade, Orelkin began to notice small changes in the archives. Boxes disappeared from storage. Catalog numbers were reassigned. Even his own reports were quietly rewritten, their wording altered to obscure references to the Gestapo infiltration. The medal's photograph was removed from the file entirely. At first he assumed bureaucratic error, but as the pattern grew clearer, he realized it was deliberate. Someone, or something, was systematically erasing V from history. He tried to raise questions discreetly. Each time he was met with the same response: a faint smile, a change of subject, and eventually a warning. "You're chasing ghosts, comrade. The war is over." But the war had never ended for him. It had only changed its shape. In 1952, Orelkin received a coded summons to a nondescript building on the outskirts of Moscow. He was escorted to a dimly lit room where an aging officer awaited him. The man introduced himself only as Colonel Mirov. His demeanor was calm, his eyes unreadable. On the table between them lay a folder stamped "Restricted. Internal intelligence only." "You've been asking about Königsberg," Mirov said quietly. "That's a dangerous curiosity." Orelkin said nothing. The colonel opened the folder, revealing several documents, copies of German interrogation transcripts, and fragments of Soviet intercepts. Among them was a single page Orelkin had never seen before. It was written in German but marked with a red Soviet seal. "The existence of the operative codenamed V was known to us," Mirov said, "but his mission was not sanctioned." Orelkin frowned. "Not sanctioned? Then whose operative was he?" Mirov's eyes flicked toward him. His allegiance was complicated. He began as one of ours, but somewhere along the line, he started sending messages that no one could decipher. We received transmissions that didn't match any cipher in use. Not to Moscow, not to Berlin. He was communicating with someone else. The words sent a chill down Orelkin's spine. Someone else? Mirov leaned forward. Perhaps another network. Perhaps himself. "You've read his notes. You saw his words. I must become the wall. Do you understand what that means?" Orelkin shook his head, slowly. "It means he was no longer serving a nation," the colonel said. "He was serving the secret itself." Mirov closed the folder, slid it across the table, and stood. "You will stop your investigation now. If you continue, there will be consequences for you and for the memory of those who died believing in the cause you serve." Then he was gone, leaving Orelkin alone with the folder. When he opened it again, he found only blank pages inside. He left the building that night under a cold drizzle, feeling as though the city had grown teeth. Every face on the street seemed to watch him. Every sound felt sharper, closer. He realized then that the same machinery that had buried V was now turning toward him. The months that followed were a slow descent into paranoia. His mail arrived, opened. His neighbors changed without notice. A man in a gray coat appeared on the opposite side of the street each morning, always reading the same newspaper. Orelkin began keeping his notes hidden in multiple locations, inside books, behind loose tiles, beneath floorboards. He lived like the man he had studied, divided between truth and survival. Yet he could not stop. The more the world tried to erase V, the more he felt compelled to bring him back. He returned to Kaliningrad under false pretenses in the winter of 1954, carrying a forged authorization signed by a defunct department. The city was different now. Soviet flags hung from rebuilt facades, propaganda posters covered the ruins, and the old German streets had been renamed after Russian heroes. But beneath the surface, nothing had changed. The ghosts were still there, whispering beneath layers of fresh paint and cement. Orelkin found the site where the Gestapo headquarters had once stood. It was a vacant lot now, the ground uneven and overgrown with weeds. But as he walked its perimeter, his boots crunching against the frost, he felt the same strange vibration in the air he had felt years before. The faint hum of something alive beneath the soil. He knelt and pressed his palm against the ground. It was cold, but not dead. He began digging. It took hours, working with frozen fingers and a stolen shovel, before he uncovered anything. At first, it was only fragments of stone, shards of glass, rusted nails. Then near the foundation's edge, his blade struck metal. He cleared the dirt away slowly, revealing the outline of a sealed metal container. Inside was a single object, wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, his breath caught. It was another medal, identical to the one found years before. But this one bore an inscription scratched by hand into its surface. Not for country, for silence. Orelkin sat in the frozen dirt, staring at it as the first light of dawn crept across the horizon. He felt both triumph and terror. The second medal proved V had prepared multiple hiding places, perhaps anticipating that one would be lost. It also proved that someone had returned after the war to bury it again. Perhaps an accomplice, perhaps another shadow in the same network. He left the site at sunrise, the medal hidden beneath his coat. Within days, he was back in Moscow. But word of his unsanctioned trip had already reached the wrong ears. He was summoned for questioning, suspended, and quietly forced into early retirement. His clearance was revoked, his files seized, and yet, even stripped of authority, Orelkin continued to write. He filled notebooks with his findings, cross-referencing every rumor, every scrap of testimony. He traced names of officers stationed in Königsberg in 1944, uncovering patterns of sudden transfers, unexplained deaths, missing records. Some of those names matched Soviet operatives who had vanished during the same period. It was as though both sides had decided to erase a shared secret, a collaboration that neither could afford to acknowledge. By the 1960s, Orelkin's obsession had consumed him entirely. He lived alone in a cramped apartment lined with papers, photographs, and maps. The sound reels sat on a shelf beside the medals, gathering dust. He rarely left home, surviving on ration bread and tea. Visitors described him as haunted, his eyes always darting to the walls, as though expecting them to whisper. In his final years, he began to speak aloud to the ghost of V. Sometimes in Russian, sometimes in German. He would sit at his desk, listening to the faint hiss of the reel spinning, and murmur, "I found you. You're not gone." Neighbors said that on some nights they could hear faint tapping sounds from his apartment, slow, deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone on the other side of the wall was answering. When Orelkin died in 1971, his apartment was sealed by the state. The official inventory listed nothing of importance, but decades later, when archivists reopened the property during a renovation, they found a hidden compartment behind the bedroom wall. Inside were 2 medals, a worn notebook, and a tape reel labeled simply V. The Last Voice. The reel was played once in 1986 by a historian who described hearing only static, but those present in the room claimed something else. They said that beneath the noise, faint and distant, a man's voice could be heard whispering words in German and Russian, alternating between them like a code. The last phrase was clear in both languages. "Do not let them bury me again." Since then, the recording has vanished. Some say it was destroyed. Others insist it remains locked away in a private archive somewhere deep in Moscow, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. If you've stayed through the decades of this mystery, through the walls, the tunnels, and the silences that governments built to contain it, then you've already stepped beyond history into something else. Like Orelkin, you've begun to listen where others only hear noise. And if you feel the echo of that voice through the static, then you already know the truth. V was never just one man. He was the embodiment of every secret the world has buried to survive its own lies. Stay close, because the 6th and final descent will reveal what lay beyond silence, what Orelkin never lived to uncover, and what still trembles beneath the ruins of Königsberg. The ruins of Königsberg do not sleep. Even now, under the name Kaliningrad, beneath the polished Soviet facades and modern asphalt, the old bones of the city stir in the dark. What was once the center of the Reich's eastern machinery has become a quiet, unmarked grave of secrets, and somewhere within that silence, in the pulse beneath the stone, the last traces of V still wait. When the wall behind Orelkin's apartment was opened in 1986, and the reel labeled V, the last voice was played, the sound it released was unlike any ordinary recording. Those present said the air itself changed. The faint hum that emerged from the speakers was not static, but a kind of trembling rhythm, as if something alive was struggling to form words through interference. The archivists dismissed it as a magnetic defect, a product of deterioration, but those who stood closest to the player heard something else, a whisper threading through the noise, layered with breaths and pauses, too deliberate to be mechanical. A historian named Sokolov later wrote in his private journal that the voice said, very faintly, "They erased the truth, but not the sound." When asked later about the incident, he refused to discuss it again. Within a year, he was gone, reported missing during a research trip near the Baltic border. After that, the reel disappeared. Officially, it was transferred to the Central Archives in Moscow for restoration. Unofficially, no such transfer record exists. The tape has never been seen again. Some say it was destroyed by order of the Intelligence Bureau. Others claim it was sealed inside a vault reserved for artifacts considered potentially destabilizing to historical continuity. What makes a voice dangerous? Perhaps it is the way it resists silence. Perhaps it is the way it keeps speaking after history has decided it should not. By the late 1990s, Kaliningrad had become a different city. New roads, new monuments, tourists walking the same streets where the Gestapo once moved like shadows. Yet deep under those foundations, the remnants of the tunnels still existed. Local workers occasionally unearthed small sections while laying pipelines or repairing foundations, but they were quickly reburied by order of the municipality. The official reason was safety. The unofficial reason was simpler. No one wanted to disturb what still lingered there. But in 2003, during construction near the old cathedral district, an excavation crew struck something unusual, an underground chamber not marked on any post-war map. Inside were fragments of metal shelves, broken jars, and a sealed concrete wall with a Soviet-era warning painted across its surface. Restricted zone. Do not open. The site was closed immediately. The workers were ordered to silence. Yet one of them, a man named Sergei Abramov, secretly photographed the interior before it was sealed again. The images, grainy and dim, showed what appeared to be a small metal door embedded in the wall. On it, scratched in uneven Cyrillic letters, was a single word: Vernost, loyalty. When the photograph surfaced years later on an obscure online forum dedicated to Cold War mysteries, they reignited the legend of V. Was it a coincidence? A forgery? Or had Orelkin been right, that the walls themselves contained the final chapter of a story both sides wanted buried? What followed was a quiet resurgence of interest among historians and independent researchers. They combed through declassified Soviet files, searching for anything related to Königsberg operations. Most found nothing but redacted pages and shredded records, but one researcher, a linguist named Natalia Resnick, found a partial memorandum from 1945 referencing an unresolved operative burial beneath a former Gestapo structure. The file was incomplete, its last line cut mid-sentence: containment protocol initiated, subject code. The rest was torn away. Resnick published her findings anonymously, using a pseudonym. Months later, her apartment was broken into. Her hard drives were taken. Her notes vanished. She left Russia soon after and has not been heard from since. The pattern was clear. Anyone who came close to V's secret was swallowed by the same silence that had claimed him. It was not just history resisting revelation. It was as if the silence itself had become an entity, defending what it contained. There is a theory whispered among archivists and intelligence historians that V's final transmission was not a simple radio message, but an encoded psychological weapon, a sound frequency that carried embedded phrases capable of influencing emotion and memory. According to this theory, V had discovered a method of transmitting not words, but suggestions hidden in tone and rhythm. To the untrained ear, it would sound like static. To those who listened long enough, it would begin to shape thought. Ridiculous, perhaps. And yet every person who listened to that reel described the same reaction: unease, pressure behind the eyes, the faint sensation of being watched. By 2010, rumors began to spread that fragments of the reel had resurfaced on the black market, disguised as forgotten wartime recordings. Amateur historians claimed to have heard clips of it online. Short bursts of sound accompanied by spectral frequencies. The clips vanished as quickly as they appeared, but one file survived, recovered by a digital archivist from Germany. When analyzed, the waveform revealed something extraordinary. At precisely the 2-second mark, the static shaped itself into a pattern that, when converted visually, formed the letter V. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe the last whisper of a man who had mastered the art of survival through invisibility. It is said that near the end of his mission, V realized he could no longer trust either side. The Soviets had abandoned him. The Germans would destroy him. And so he made a final decision to become the message itself, to fuse his identity into sound, into code, into something that would outlive all empires. In one of his recovered notes, written days before his capture, he wrote, "They will forget names, but they cannot silence the pulse. I will be the pulse." Perhaps he succeeded. Modern acoustic engineers who analyzed surviving wartime Soviet broadcasts have identified a recurring anomaly, a low-frequency tone appearing intermittently between transmissions from early 1944. It does not match any known radio pattern of the period. When amplified, the tone forms a rhythmic cadence resembling a heartbeat. To some, it's interference. To others, it's V, still transmitting from beyond the wall. There's an unease that comes from knowing a secret too long suppressed. Kaliningrad remains haunted not by ghosts, but by memory itself. Tourists walking near the old cathedral sometimes report feeling dizzy, hearing faint whispering beneath the cobblestones. Others claim to see light flickering through drainage grates at night. Brief flashes like Morse code, gone before they can be photographed. Authorities blame underground electrical faults. The locals know better. They call it the breathing wall. In the years following Orelkin's death, his personal writings, long hidden by the state, were gradually released. In one of his final notes, written days before he died, he left a strange message that few understood. Every wall remembers. When the world is ready to listen, it will speak again. That sentence was later engraved, without explanation, onto a small memorial plaque near the ruins of the old Gestapo site. Tourists pass it daily, rarely stopping to read. But those who do sometimes feel a faint vibration underfoot, a tremor too subtle to be explained by traffic or construction. Somewhere below, perhaps, the past still shifts. If V was a man, he is long dead. If he was more than a man, an idea encoded into the machinery of the century, then perhaps he never died at all. The silence that swallowed him continues to speak in its own language, through archives that erase themselves, through missing files, through stories whispered across decades. And yet, the true danger of V's story lies not in what he did, but in what he revealed. Infiltrating the Gestapo was only the surface of his mission. His deeper purpose, what Moscow never admitted, was to test the limits of human loyalty under absolute control, to see whether identity could survive total transformation. The answer, perhaps, was no. Or perhaps the answer was the wall itself, a man who became the silence to remain whole. Those who believe in him say he achieved something no agent before or since has managed, to outlive both his masters and his enemies, to remain unclaimed by either side, to exist as the perfect ghost. And if you walk the streets of Kaliningrad tonight, under the heavy fog that rolls in from the Baltic, you might still feel him there, in the echo of footsteps that don't match your own, in the faint hum beneath the stone, when the city grows quiet. Listen closely, and you may hear it, the whisper of metal against concrete, the steady rhythm of breath that doesn't belong to you. And if you do, remember the words carved into the wall 70 years ago. I did not break. V's story ends where it began, in silence. But silence is not absence. It is memory, compressed until it becomes sound again. So, as this final descent closes, remember this. The next time you hear static, on a radio, through a recording, between stations, pause for a moment before tuning it away. You may be hearing the last echo of a man who vanished in 1944 and refused to die quietly. And if his voice still travels through the noise, searching for someone who will listen, perhaps that someone is you. If you've walked with me through every shadow of this story, through its echoes and its ghosts, then you've already proven what V believed, that the past cannot be buried while even one person still listens. So before you go, keep the silence alive. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your mark below. Tell us what you heard in the static and from where you're watching this story unfold. Because the walls still breathe. And somewhere, deep beneath the ruins of Königsberg, the pulse of 1944 still beats, waiting for another ear to hear it.